Welcome to the Nerd Goblin Podcast.
Welcome to the second episode of the Nerd Goblin Podcast. If you didn't listen to last week's podcast, keep in mind that it's going to be a little rough as it was our first one, but please check it out on SoundCloud or iTunes or whatever podcasting source that you use. We're going to start out today by having Bill and Guy join me as always. My name is Jonathan. I'm going to be kind of hosting today. And the start today is we're going to do a little bit of news.
This is the news.
Last week, Game of Thrones editor Jane Johnson voiced her displeasure over the HBO series departing from the canon of the novels. She stated, "Not loving these huge divergences. Read the books if you want to know the story the way the author intended it. This is not the first or last time that a story from print has been changed to fit the screen. How do the two of you feel about such deviations?" Start with Bill.
Well, in the case of Game of Thrones, we have a situation that's pretty well known to any fan of the show as to what's going on behind the scenes, and that is that George R.R. Martin is has not written the last of the novels yet. So what we have is a circumstance where the show is rapidly gaining ground on the reality as created by Martin, and this is causing a necessity. And, on one level, they're probably just stretching it out in order to give Martin more time to complete the novels. In another way, they're certainly adapting it to tell their own story in that medium. And I think it's an important distinction to make that, the audiences are not necessarily the same. There is not necessarily a total overlap between the literary fan base and the television medium fan base. And accordingly, you're telling perhaps maybe a different story. Maybe it's an opportunity to tell a different story to the two different audiences.
Yeah, this is such a common thing in movies and TV that nobody should really be surprised. If you look at a show like The Walking Dead, which follows the comic book series somewhat closely, there is some major divergences there. The most recent storyline in the comic book series is probably one, maybe at best 2 seasons away, and then in that show they're going to be past where the comic book story is, and they're probably going to have to do the same thing. Now, I'm of the opinion that if these divergences from the original source material are for the better and add value to the story, that it's a good thing. In Walking Dead, for example, in the comic book series, the character Shane was, gone within 6 issues, I think, but he lasted through the better part of 2 seasons in the TV series. It's when they start making arbitrary changes for no real reason that I think fans really start to get upset. At least that's when I find it annoying, and I'd prefer that they stick with the story. But if it's for the better, I'm all for it.
Yeah, I read all of the Game of Thrones books, and to be honest, I only have good things to say about the television show. This is definitely a case-by-case basis, but print is not always adaptable to video. And I think if you want to see these stories with something other than your imagination, a little flexibility is going to be required.
It's not just a matter of the flexibility, and that's certainly afforded them by, having this media alternative. There's also a question of ownership, and I think in a lot of the cases, and Guy touched upon this, there's a certain sense of ownership, I think, of the people who, were the original fans, the people who read the content, whether it's a comic book or whether it's an actual literary book. I think there's a sense of ownership amongst the fan base to recognizing the storyline, to recognizing the character development, and seeing it play out as they expect it to. And then sometimes there's disappointment when it's done differently, even if the actual difference might be otherwise perceived as an improvement on the story. I think there's this sense of like, hey, what are you guys doing to this thing that I loved so much?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would call it ownership. I guess maybe that's the best word, but there's definitely deep emotional investment into something that you've spent maybe years and years of your life, reading or, being interested in. And then, especially if it's in a negative way, you see it diverge from that, it upsets you. I understand how people feel that way, but it's an opportunity to also maybe make it better, maybe actually improve on the source material. And in a lot of cases, I think that's probably the case. I never watched the Game of Thrones, for example, but from everyone that I know that watches it, they really, really enjoy it. I suspect that maybe there's a lot of improvements over the source material there.
Oh, that's funny. I bet there's a lot of people just shouting blasphemy at their headsets right now. I agree. I think that there are improvements, and I think that what it really comes down to, let's take one of two scenarios here. So, when Game of Thrones finishes the content from the books, would you rather they just make it up as they go and assume that the people that work for HBO know how to tell a story, or would you rather see it end until George R. R. Martin rather, who writes very slowly, writes his next book?
Here's a funny idea. What if when they pass where the book storylines are at, now he's obligated to follow the TV series? It's that same thing, right? Only in reverse, and everyone would be like, "Oh, that's absurd. He's allowed to do what he wants because he created it." Well, the director and writers and actors sort of created the visual version of it, i.e. the TV series. So, shouldn't they have a little creative license as well?
I think certainly they have a degree of creative license with it. I mean, they're the ones telling the story. And if you're going with, the history of storytelling as a medium throughout human history, I mean, basically that's the way it's always worked before we began actually recording things. I mean, let's start with prior to writing things down, stories were handed down from generation to generation, and everybody puts their own kind of flavor text into it and little twists, and maybe sometimes important details are forgotten or ignored, and maybe sometimes some interesting things are added. But in the end, it's just kind of the way human beings operate. It's like we hear a good story, we tell a good story, and the next iteration of it is told just a little different. And no matter how hard you're trying to adhere to it, there's still going to be some kind of change done. Perhaps the changes are more pronounced when things are still fresh in our own minds, though.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and this issue is definitely not going to go anywhere. At the same time, let's move on. We're going to talk about a lot of different things on this podcast, and like we stated on the first one, it's a lot of the things that we're interested in or things that caught our eye. And one of the things this week is that Google has published a report on Backchannel in response to an AP report stating that their driverless cars had been involved in 11 accidents. All accidents were minor, with light damage and no injuries, and that was a quote, and happened to over 1.7 million miles of testing. Further, all accidents were attributed to the human drivers, not the self-driving cars. Google thinks they have their thumb on the future here. How do you two feel about this? Start with Guy.
First question, when you say it was attributed to the human drivers, does that mean other drivers on the road driving non-self-driving vehicles, or does it mean the human operator that is physically inside the self-driving car? I guess the reason I'm asking that is because the thought occurs to me, if these vehicles become proliferated and are commonplace, how engaged in the process of operating the vehicle does the driver have to be? Is it going to be complete autopilot? Like, you're not even paying attention to the world around you as the car drives you from point A to point B? Or do you still have to, metaphorically speaking, have your foot hovering over the brake pedal waiting to jump in at a moment's notice in case the vehicle fails in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, just to answer your question, the answer of fault is that it was the other car. It wasn't the Google car that was found to be at fault there. And let's go to Bill.
So a little bit of quick calculator math says that this is about a rate of 647 crashes per 1 million miles, based on 11 accidents and 1.7 million miles of testing. So just by comparison, the ranges in the last 15 years, you're getting, in the human population, you're getting something around the order of 400 something. We have like a 400, and it's the lowest it's ever been actually in around 2008 to 2009, according to AAA's data. And so we're getting numbers that are, within the same order of magnitude of the population's rate of automobile crashes. So I'm not really finding it alarming. It is higher, but that said, we're also picking a smaller data sample, so it shouldn't be a surprise that we're not going to necessarily have the truly representative number. I don't know. As far as how I feel about this, I think I feel like a lot of other people do. There's a large level of mistrust, and it's really difficult to presume that the machine is going to effectively drive itself and operate itself better than human judgment can manage.
So a couple things. I looked at those stats as well, Bill, and what I found is as early as it is in the process, for those stats to be so comparable, I thought was an amazing sign for Google. And into the early stage of things, going further with that, they're working on such AI improvements such as a car taking a right turn at a red light, which is common in the US, and those cars so far have a hard time with that, which is holding up traffic. But I guess the question I'd like to ask you too is, let's say that you were involved in an accident with a car that didn't have a driver in the driver's seat, or maybe wasn't driving. How would you feel if you were found at fault?
Assuming we're at a point in time where the technology's proven, the proper regulations are in place, and in other words, it's a commonplace thing, I don't think I personally would feel any different. If we're talking about what if this happened tomorrow, I'm not sure I could answer the question the same way, but looking ahead in the future of how long will it be until we have self-driving cars everywhere? 10 years, maybe 20 years? I don't know what that number is. I'm just guessing off the top of my head. But when we get to that point, I can't imagine feeling any different than I would now.
Well, I am aware that Cadillac is supposed to have a self-driving car for sale in the 2016 production year. So that, it's a lot sooner than maybe you think it is. That said, I do not know exactly to what full extent are we talking about this here. Are we talking about a car that's going to, completely drive itself, or are we talking about really nothing more than sort of an expansion upon existing cruise control? Now, in terms of the technology, we have this trust level of technology throughout our lives all the time. And in a lot of ways, I don't think we really necessarily even think about it. And in some ways, we probably place a lot more trust than we might otherwise. Let me throw just a hypothetical example to the two of you as a sort of a follow-up question. If what's that silly game? And I hate to call it a game because it's really just stupidity. Where someone holds their hands spread apart on a table, and then you take a knife and you poke it in between your fingers on the table. Remember that scene from what was it? One of the Alien movies? Was it the second Alien movie where the android did that game to the person hyper fast? Would you trust a machine to do that? That was designed to do that exact thing? And if you were to place your hand on a template on a table, would you trust the machine to do that more, or would you trust another human being to do that more? And I know for myself, I think it's the machine that I'm going to trust. I'm going to trust human engineering more than I'm going to trust human behavior in, engaging in what is accepted as risky behavior. And let's be honest, your driving is definitively risky behavior.
Well, in the example of us flying through space in hypersleep for years and years and years, I'm going to probably trust the android to play the knife game with me. As far as, driving cars or self-driving cars today, I don't know if we're there yet. And again, like I said, when the technology's proven, and when it's proven to people, right? Not when it's just proven in a lab, when everyone sees it functioning. I think it's going to be something that we don't think of any more strangely than we do smartphones. You mentioned Cadillac's going to have a self-driving car in its upcoming model year. I've seen different companies talking about quote-unquote self-driving features like that. My understanding of them, and maybe I'm not tuned into it enough, is that they're just doing things like you said, an enhanced cruise control, or being able to do parallel parking without the interaction of the driver. I didn't get the impression that it was anywhere close to what we consider an actual self-driving car to be.
Yeah, Google's car is definitely driving cross-country under AI, so that is definitely a little bit different. I think that the first step is definitely what Cadillac is doing, just from a comfort level for humanity. But if I think about the drivers that I see on a day-to-day basis, where they're eating a taco with one hand and texting with the other, I think I might go ahead and just let the computer drive.
Well, to what extent are we letting the computer drive, at the same time? Does this mean that, I could knock off a six-pack and get behind the wheel and just turn on the old autopilot and fall asleep if I feel like, have a little party in the cabin, to what extent is my responsibility as a driver under this, sort of technology change?
Once it's, commonplace, I sort of envisioned it as you're not the quote-unquote driver anymore. You're just a passenger. Again, I don't think we're anywhere near that. I gut feeling here is it's, a decade or more away. I could be totally off base. I have no idea. But yeah, I don't see why you need to be engaged if you're, if we're calling it an actual self-driving car. I remember an article, I think it was last year, they were talking about the big car show in Nevada. One of the automakers had its car drive from San Francisco to Nevada. The pilot of the vehicle had to be completely engaged, though. He had to be ready at a moment's notice to take control of the vehicle in case there was a problem, and it couldn't maneuver around the city. All it could do was drive on the highway in more or less a straight line. But the technology is, was my impression that that's sort of where it's at. Still a long ways away from being 100% fully automated.
It's definitely something we're going to want to keep our eye on. It's definitely an interesting topic. Let's move on, though, for today and talk about something that is a little bit strange for us. We're going to talk about a boxing match, but that's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about the financial numbers of the Manny Pacquiao-Floyd Mayweather fight, because they were released recently. The fight brought in $400 million in pay-per-view, according to initial numbers released by HBO and Showtime, which doubles the previous pay-per-view record. More staggering to me, the live gate, the tickets for the event live, brought in $72 million from the sales of approximately 16,000 tickets. That's an average of $4,500 per ticket. Can either of you explain this kind of revenue? Start with Bill.
Wow, explain. It's difficult because it's not the sort of thing that appeals to me. Number one, let me just say that, I view boxing and MMA fights, I view it with a certain level of barbarism that I don't necessarily feel like it really has a place in modern society anymore. So, getting that little, personal feeling out of the way. As far as the money, I mean, these guys have been pimping their, expected, anticipated fight for 10 years, 15 years? How long has it been? Everybody's been wanting them to fight. And now, they're both on, the doorstep of retirement, and it's like they got to get the money, they got to get the paycheck while they still can. Just out of, a point of comparison, so that represented 4.4 million pay-per-view buys in order to arrive at those numbers. To compare to, say, UFC, they get 100,000 something on routine fights, and their big fights, they do 600,000 plus. So this is, a full order of magnitude larger than what, the closest comparable sort of sport can deliver on pay-per-view. As far as the live gate, I mean, this is just the epitome of a luxury event, right? I mean, number one, we're only talking about 16,000 tickets, so that's, not even really a quarter of a big football game. And furthermore, I mentioned that the event was being, promoted in essence for a decade. So you have a lot of wealthy people that this is that sort of entertainment for them.
Another interesting number that you didn't mention that I find equally astounding is the purse money. I believe I read they got 80 and 120 million respectively. That's a crazy amount of money for, each quote-unquote performer. You don't see that in any other medium that I can think of. That said, I was mildly interested in seeing this fight. I'm not a boxing fan, but the pay-per-view was $100, and my takeaway from that was, why don't they want to proliferate this sport anymore? Make it affordable for the average person that might otherwise only be mildly curious about it. That's such a expensive hour or two or whatever's amount of entertainment that, it's totally something that I'm not willing to invest in. I'm guessing I'm not unique in that. Why would they want to make it so exclusive. I'm not really sure what the answer is to that, and that was again sort of the takeaway I got from it. They have these fights so infrequently that, like I said, it makes me wonder why don't they want to proliferate it more and try to bring it into the mainstream again.
I'm sure they'd love to bring it into the mainstream. I mean, basically anybody involved with anything that makes money or can be perceived to make money, they're inclined to want to do it. I think it's really just not as popular as it once was, and I think that's a good thing. I think if we're talking about basically two men giving each other long-term brain damage, I think there should be a certain amount of restraint on the profiteering from such endeavors.
Yeah, I think when it comes to this specific fight, the one thing that boxing, and really who cares about boxing, but the one thing they've done right is their scheduling. It's the beginning of May and the beginning of September, and there's nothing else going on. Sometimes people just want something to do, and I think that the scheduling is the one thing that has kind of driven those pay-per-view numbers, because, I mean, who doesn't want to have a party in the first part of May? I think that's really it.
I don't remember exactly what else was going on, but I do remember seeing a little news blip that there was some things happening like that same weekend that were competing with it. Maybe Avengers was opening that weekend. There was another piece of media, I don't know, was it an award show or something? There was other things going on that it was competing with. So while, yeah, there's, generally speaking, not a lot going on in May as far as TV premieres and whatnot, it wasn't completely, the only thing to do. We had choices.
Well, what it was the Kentucky Derby, which airs at 6:15 Eastern. And then the next thing that was supposed to be a competitor for it was Game 7 of the first round of the NBA, which isn't exactly a huge draw or competitor, really. And even if you were interested in both those things, oddly enough, the timeline flowed almost perfectly. So you could watch the Kentucky Derby, you could watch Game 7, and then you could tune in for the pay-per-view fight.
There's also the question that the audiences aren't necessarily always the same. I mean, are people that are interested in Marvel's Avengers going to be a holistically equivalent audience as the people interested in watching boxing? And, I mean, isn't it a sort of commentary on the notion of movies like the Avengers, that we get to see this sort of violence on an epic scale through CGI that's so realistic? I mean, is there maybe not even a certain market? Are things like that killing the market for boxing?
All interesting points, but I think that is enough about boxing and the financials behind boxing. Let's move on. Let's talk about Telltale Games. They have recently announced a partnership with Marvel to bring their story-driven game line to the Marvel Universe. This will complement the wildly successful Walking Dead storyline, Borderlands, Game of Thrones, and Minecraft games. What are your experiences with these games, and is this something that you're looking forward to? Guy?
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to it. I saw that news blip the other day. Unfortunately, if I remember correctly, they're saying this is like the very earliest of news releases regarding the subject, and 2017, I think, is when they're talking about when we'll see this game. So it's so far away, and we don't know what to expect from it. Is it going to be a Avengers-related universe game, or Spider-Man or X-Men or something else? Like, nobody knows anything about it yet at this point. But that said, I did play the Walking Dead Telltale games, and it was a lot of fun. They are not really, super interactive games, at least the one that I played anyway. It was basically like walking you through a pretty deep story that you got to interact with in basically a lot of superficial ways. It would prompt you to do something when like the story was going through the narrative. So it'd be like something's happening and then quick push X 10 times really fast, and that would help you or have you do the action of attacking the zombie or whatever the case may be in that game. So I'm not sure what to expect out of this, but I am looking forward to it, and I think it's probably going to be at least a good story and narrative, if nothing else.
Yeah, I gotta say that I'm not particularly looking forward to these. I mean, at least in terms of the genre of a game, I don't personally view them like they're games, and you really touched upon why. the level of interaction, the level of player involvement is just not really there. Really, it's more of another medium to tell a story, and I think it could be something wonderful for that, for the right audience, for the right person. But it's not what I'm interested in. I see it as sort of an evolution of, I don't know, these books I used to read when I was maybe in like eighth grade, sort of a fantasy genre where, like, you have to, in the course of reading, you have to pick a choice. And depending on which choice you make, you have to turn to a certain page, and the story plays out a little bit different. They were fun for a point in time, but I find them inadequate as entertainment and as storytelling in terms of what the author intended this, how the story to play out.
Yeah, the first Telltale Games Walking Dead entry won Game of the Year, and that's what made me look at it. And they're fun games, but they're not exactly exciting. I played through the two Walking Dead storylines and found that they were basically ideal diversions just before bed. I'd play them and it would kind of lull me to sleep and whatnot. I'm not sure if the uniqueness of the gameplay is going to have staying value, but I gotta say, partnering with the Marvel Universe, if it is going to have staying power, that's probably the way to do it. Let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about Verizon. Verizon has agreed to buy AOL for a staggering $4.4 billion. What do you remember about AOL, and can you at all explain this price, Bill?
Wow, what I remember about AOL is using them as, a dial-up ISP, essentially. For at least a while, I probably, like a lot of other people, used them for their email service. It staggers me to think that they're still worth $4.4 billion, because clearly they have continuing value above and beyond the fact that they no longer have that sort of market presence anymore. I'm sure there are still a lot of people, numbering, in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, who use them for the same things that, I had used them for in the past. But, technology has really just passed them by with, Fios and cable modems and everything else. You don't need them for the internet connectivity. So, I guess I am a little surprised, but maybe I shouldn't be, because it's not like they went away. They still have a network. They still have an infrastructure. They still have some kind of media clout. In other words, they still have value.
I was shocked. When I heard this story, I had to literally say to myself, what does AOL do now? And I had to look it up. And even in looking it up, I still don't have a clear picture of what it is they do. Like, now they're trying to be a video media distribution advertising thing. I'm really not sure. It's very cloudy. I can't see, like, why anyone would want to even own that company. But, clearly I'm not the person making these kinds of decisions. Luckily for them, I guess. The CEO of AOL, I believe, is the guy that came from Google. He's been there years and years. I read that he stands to make something like $180 million off of this deal, which is another kind of staggering number. It's not in the billions, but $180 million is pretty good day's work. Something else that this reminded me of was a while back, Facebook purchased an app called WhatsApp, and that was another one of those like WTF moments for me. They purchased it for 18 or 22 million, or I'm sorry, billion with a B dollars, and I had never even heard of it. I looked into it. What is it? It's just sort of like a chat app. I did an informal poll of everybody I know. Nobody I know uses it. That was another like staggering business transaction of $20 billion to buy something that just doesn't seem like there's value there. And, I feel kind of the same way about this. It's really puzzling.
Well, I mean, as I understand it, basically what AOL is now is content. They're just a content provider. And, accordingly, that kind of jives with the $4.4 billion valuation. I mean, they certainly have the name brand behind it. And, they're supporting, a lot of blogs and things like that. Now, what's interesting is that what I read, and I ought to source this, I can't remember where I read it, but apparently Verizon's intention is to cut loose all of the content aspects of the purchase. So basically, there's going to be a lot of bloggers that were formerly under contract or are currently under contract with AOL who may not continue to be once Verizon seals this deal. So really what Verizon wants is the technology and the advertising avenue and revenues from this deal. I don't want to pretend to be very in the know in terms of like business, but I'm certainly a little bit interested in the outside realm of the technology aspect, and I think everybody feels a little bit of nostalgia for AOL.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. You're getting a name brand, and obviously they've spent a lot of money developing the services they do provide. If you were going to look at 10 years ago what this company would have sold for, it would have been much, much higher. But I think today, I imagine most of those executives were happy with that price. That said, let's move on a little bit. We're going to work our way into our segment today, which is the Avengers Age of Ultron.
And now for our feature.
We're going to do a spoiler alert here. If you have not seen the new Avengers movie and you care about spoilers, now would be a good time to save the rest of this podcast for after you have seen it. Also, a little background. Joss Whedon is the man who directed the Avengers Age of Ultron movie and the other previous Avengers movies. We're going to be referring to him going forward. Now that spoiler alert is out of the way, let's talk Avengers. First, let's talk misogyny. Joss Whedon has been loudly and vocally criticized for his portrayal of female characters in his Avengers movies. Do either of you see any basis for this, Guy?
Yeah, I saw something about him deleting his Twitter account and saying it's not because of anything to do with this allegations of sexism. I've never picked up any sort of hard misogyny themes from his movies outside of the realm that already exists within comic book, the comic book storylines that he's basing this off of. Certainly in comic books, it's the female heroes are big-breasted, scantily clad women, and generally, bad things happen to them, and they're rescued by the male heroes. That's just a common theme in comic books, and that's what these stories are based off of. But I don't feel like it's anything that he's doing in particular. In fact, Black Widow came off as a relatively strong character in my mind. I don't know. I just didn't see it. I don't know where the flack is coming from.
So, first of all, full disclosure, I'm a guy. I don't exactly feel like I have the perspective to commentate on the issue of misogyny in a very meaningful way, other than to say that I'm aware that it's been an issue. It's, if you will, it's a trait of our society, as far back as you want to take it. But without getting into that exact conversation and focusing on the movie, clearly, the movie picked Scarlett Johansson. They cast her in this role. She's got attributes about her. She's, a very attractive woman, and that helps. To flip the coin, though, I don't look anything like Chris Hemsworth. He's a hunk. He's a muscular guy. He's not exactly, what a normal, average male looks like either. So I think when we go to movies, we're paying to see, people that stand out. Not to mention the fact that these are superheroes. They stand out innately. So to make them, to exploit them on their physical characteristics and beauty, I don't think it's a particular stretch. But, that's my perspective as a guy, and maybe not as someone who's perfectly attuned to the issue of misogyny in our culture.
First off, thank you so much for clarifying that voice does not belong to a woman named Bill. It's very helpful. But going further with this, Guy, you mentioned that this is an aspect of comic books in general. Do you think there's any misogyny in comics? Do you think that might be an issue there?
Is there? Yeah, sure. Is it an issue? I guess on the whole, it's better for society than maybe. But they're selling comic books to a demographic, a very, very, very small demographic of, young males mostly. Not to say that some females don't read comics, they do, but we talked in the last episode about the kind of readership that comic books get. It's small, blockbuster, super A-list comic book titles are lucky if they sell 100,000 issues. So they're trying to appeal to their very narrow customer base, and one way to do that is to sell sex, right? Sex sells, and that's kind of what they're doing.
Let's do a quick hit here. So, yes or no, is this just a controversy for the sake of having a controversy?
No, it's not. It's a real thing. Misogyny is a real thing. This is still part of a women's rights kind of thing, and we see it in gaming, we see it in movies, we see it in regular culture in the professional workplace. It does exist. I don't want to pretend that it doesn't. But by the same token, I think that within movies where we're needing to cater to an audience and provide something that has appeal, and again, sex sells, I think it would be foolish to say that misogyny doesn't exist, but it's equally foolish to pretend that we're not going to be producing these sort of big media efforts and not appeal to what people want to see.
Yeah, one thing I wonder is this is mostly not. This isn't like, oh my God, there's misogyny and sexism in movies, right? This was directly an attack on Joss Whedon. My one thing I want to remark on that, and there's going to be more of, oh my God, blasphemy, you've never seen it, but I never watched Firefly, Serenity, and I never really watched Buffy either. But my understanding is that there are some very strong female characters, lead characters in the case of Buffy, in those shows that he directed and wrote a lot of. Is he a misogynist? Is he sexist? His history might suggest otherwise if you look at what else he's done.
Well, in the context of the Avengers, I mean, the facts remain. The movies are about the Avengers. Iron Man isn't a woman. Thor isn't a woman. Well, not in the movie anyway. I mean, and we do have the female character in Scarlet Witch and Black Widow. And I mean, I think they're both represented well. It's not like they're shown to be, not powerful. I mean, not for nothing, but Black Widow isn't even a quote-unquote superpowered being, and yet she's still, an Avenger. She's part of this group. She's an instrumental part of this group. Now, that said, of course they do take her role to, float off into, and spoiler alert again, float into this, love affair with Bruce Banner that is implied having been existing since the previous movies. And that maybe that casts some sort of shadow on the whole thing. But in the end, she's an Avenger. Scarlet Witch, it ends the movie. She's an Avenger now.
Yeah, let me just do a stance here. So, Guy mentioned Serenity and Firefly. So, in Serenity, the most popular, I would say, other than Nathan Fillion's Malcolm Reynolds' character in the movie is Summer Glau's River Tam, who is portrayed as the strongest character in the movie. Buffy had a female lead of Buffy, and yeah, there was some romance and drama that went into that. And I may or may not, probably may not, be qualified to comment on this topic, but it feels as if the people that are criticizing Joss Whedon on this issue are not looking back into his history. And I think when he left Twitter, I think they kind of smelled a little bit of blood in the water. And, he did leave Twitter, and we don't know why. But let's move on. We've got a lot more to talk about right here. Let's talk about some editing and some drama that went along with it in the 2-hour and 20-minute runtime for the Avengers Age of Ultron. Joss Whedon on the Empire Films podcast regarding the scene that you may have blinked and missed, a scene where Thor took a shirtless bath in a cave pool in order to see a vision. He stated, with the cave, it really turned into, they pointed a gun at the farm's head and said, give us the cave or we'll take out the farm, in a civilized way. He further stated, it got really, really unpleasant. This was all again on the Empire Films podcast. In summary, Marvel wanted certain story segments and not so much others. What did you think of the story moments in the movie? Specifically the dream sequences and the farm scenes? And comparatively, how do you feel about the pool scene with Thor? Guy?
Yeah, we talked about this the other day. like I must have dozed off or something. I just totally missed the pool scene. And then when Thor comes out of nowhere and jumps on the cradle and lightning bolts everywhere and Vision comes out, like I didn't even really understand the context as to why he was suddenly so adamant about making, the Vision become a being. So, I mean, they must have done something wrong there for me to just totally miss it. I don't know.
I didn't miss it. I caught on to it right away. I'm not trying to give myself a pat in the back, but it seemed, I don't want to say obvious to me, but I certainly followed along that, essentially Thor had seen a vision of the future, and the implication was that in the vision of the future, the character Vision was important. And important enough that Thor, busts into the room and shows up out of nowhere, interrupting, what's about to maybe become, some violence involved between members of the Avengers over whether or not, it's ethical or right in order to, for Tony and Bruce Banner to create Vision, who of course isn't named at this point. But so really it's a plot device is what we're getting down to. Is the pool scene was a plot device, and maybe on a lesser extent an excuse to show Chris Hemsworth with his shirt off. But as far as the farm scene, I think it too is a certain extent of a plot device, but I think more it's about character development and taking the characters out of the action sequence and humanizing them, making them more real. In particular, showing Hawkeye with his family. I think, we see him get wounded in the early going. There was maybe a little bit of foreshadowing. We knew that a character was going to die at the end of the Avengers movie, and between him getting wounded and the introduction to his family, I have to admit that I was starting to think at that point in the movie that it was going to be Hawkeye who bought the bullet at the end.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking that, but with when you mentioned it, it would have probably made more sense, right? It humanized him. It made us care about the character. I was pretty surprised when Quicksilver died. Like, I didn't know anyone was gonna die. I wasn't aware of any spoilers ahead of time, so that was a big surprise to me. And that was, sort of a character that, like, did we really care about him all that much? They didn't build him up too well. It wasn't like, oh no, I wish they wouldn't have killed that character. It would have been better for the story if it was Hawkeye, but I guess they want to use him some more in the future.
538 this week did a article about the lifespan of Avengers and how the rate of them dying is fairly high. And what they really wanted to tie that to was the fact that a lot of the actors' contracts are running out while the Avengers films are going to continue on. What do you see going forward?
The team that they sort of made at the end of the movie, I can say that I wasn't all extremely excited about that. It was, Black Widow and Captain America, and then War Machine showed up, Falcon showed up, the Vision was there. I think that was their, core team that they were implying was going to be the Avengers moving forward. Interesting side note, I noticed as they flashed to that building, it said New Avengers Building. There is actually a very popular series of comics called The New Avengers. I don't think they were implying that this is a new building for the Avengers. I felt like they were implying this was the New Avengers. Regardless, moving forward, I hope and I expect that in the Civil War Captain America movie, which I felt like they were kind of building up to by creating tension between Tony Stark and Captain America there. I think they were building up to that, and I think that's probably when we're really gonna find out what team makes up the Avengers in the Infinity War movies.
Well, from what I had read, and I don't know what the actual truth to this is, and I've also never read the actual comics, but apparently the new quote-unquote new Avengers, Scarlet Witch and Vision, etc., they're going to be, for all intents and purposes, they're going to be the Avengers in the Civil War movie storyline. But then when we look ahead to the Infinity Wars coming up, I guess that's the following year, from what I remember reading, it was something to the effect of, in the first part, we were going to be seeing a lot of the new Avengers and none of Hulk and Thor. and in the sequel, that's where they were going to be bringing back, Infinity Wars Part 2. That's where they would be bringing back Hulk and Thor into the storyline. I'd also be interested to see. I mean, it seems like they're probably going to be putting the Guardians of the Galaxy cast into that as well. But that's just a pure guess based on the little teasers that they give us.
So we got away from this a little bit, but I want to kind of bring it back around to the drama between Joss Whedon and Marvel. We talked in the last podcast about how important Joss Whedon has been to this franchise, the entire Marvel umbrella. What do you think about them not giving him his really creative leeway? And do you think that he's going to have any future as a director on a Marvel movie?
Is he even going to be directing any more of their movies moving forward? I thought I saw somewhere that he was completely out as after this Avengers movie. Maybe I'm mistaken there. I'm not positive, but yeah, he's been instrumental in developing the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I mean, he's also been instrumental in writing some really good comic book series as well. In particular, one that I thought was amazing was titled Astonishing X-Men. If you've never read that, you should take the time to read it. He wrote that, and it was fantastic. I thought, going back a couple years, that they basically just handed him the key to the city and said, do whatever you want, we trust you. It doesn't seem like maybe that's the case right now, does it?
So there was a little bit of press this week about that. He's not under contract to do another Marvel movie. But interestingly enough, considering the point that we talked about first about misogyny, he actually expressed interest in doing the Captain Marvel film.
Huh, that's interesting. I think I don't want to condemn Joss Whedon, and maybe that's a funny way to begin this thought. But I'm not sure that I entirely give him much of the credit at all for the success of the Marvel movies. To me, it's almost entirely the Marvel IP itself. It's the characters that have been created over time, and there's been this model that's been put forth. The plan, the way that Marvel puts its stuff out, and I think it's that whoever came up with that sort of mentality, and if it was Joss Whedon, then full credit to him. But I feel like it's the Marvel characters themselves that are selling this.
There's been so many other Marvel movies that were total failures, though, that were done by mostly other studios, Fox and Sony, right? The Daredevil movie, the Ghost Rider movie, the Punisher movies. Even the Spider-Man movies and the X-Men movies were a little bit weak, and we could all sit back and nitpick them to death about how it could have been better. It's uniquely the Marvel/Disney produced movies that have been fantastic, be it the Avengers, the Iron Mans, the Guardians of the Galaxies. And I don't know who the creative team is that put together the whole universe, but it was my understanding that Joss Whedon was directly involved in that to a big part. But, I could be wrong there.
This is a nice segue to our final point, and that is that Box Office Mojo stated that the Avengers Age of Ultron has grossed $318 million domestic and $881 million worldwide as of May 11th. These numbers are only going to continue to grow from here. Is Marvel simply printing money these days? And do you worry that this kind of success will result in more but lower quality movies?
So, more but lower quality movies, no, I don't worry about that at all. I mean, the marketplace is driven to provide what the market wants. And not that I'm a capitalist, but that's basically how this is supposed to work, right? So, we, as moviegoers, we go to these movies and we give them what amounts to be, billions of dollars to make them. They're inclined to continue to follow that same kind of formula. It's sort of a, if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality. So yeah, I think, as far as growth, I mean, that's difficult to say. I mean, who knows how much more of the population that this story can continue to reach in an effective manner. But certainly I expect it to be able to sustain itself, particularly when we're talking about the quote-unquote A-list movies, and as God mentioned, the Disney-produced versions of it. And Disney obviously has a track record in producing high-quality visual entertainment.
Side note, humanity has a serious problem when Fast and Furious is like the third top grossing movie of all time. And, Avengers is behind that. But regardless, I think, yeah, there could very well be an oversaturation point where people just get sick of this stuff. Particularly not just with Marvel stuff, but all of the different superhero stuff. When you look at it, in the broad scope, you got all of the DC movies, Batman, Supermans. They're gonna probably want to do a Justice League. They're gonna be introducing all of those characters in solo movies. And then you got all the Marvel movies. There's other smaller IPs out there that are getting picked up by movie studios, and they're trying to turn those into movies. Some of them come out really good, like 300 in Sin City, and others don't. So yeah, I am a little concerned that because of the success that these comic-based action movies have had over the last decade now, that it's just going to continue to grow and grow and grow to a point of oversaturation, and the quality is going to probably suffer. I mean, it seems like that's a foregone conclusion to me.
Yeah, it seems that way to me as well. The quality, just due to economics, they're eventually going to start rushing things out because their public investors want more money, and I think that you look at the same kind of thing with, let's take a restaurant, where restaurants have to open more and more restaurants until the quality eventually declines and then that restaurant closes. I don't know that that's not the same kind of analogy for a movie franchise.
Well, I mean, there's still not a Disney World in New Jersey, you know what I mean? So I think a lot of this has to be thought of relative to who's behind it. And again, I want to give Disney props because they seem to know how to manage these kind of things and, continue to extract revenue from them while, not really compromising the quality. In terms of, specifically the Marvel appeal and whether or not it can become saturated, I think that's, number one, it has a lot to do with the quality of the story itself, and maybe that guy is what you're getting at, that you're nervous the quality could diminish. But, we have a history of Marvel characters that goes back, decades. So it has a cross-generational appeal that I think that is really what's going to help it, kind of stay on top and remain popular for the foreseeable future. Whereas, you look at even something like Star Wars, which also has superb appeal, but I think that it speaks to a specific generation, and maybe it lost some contact along the way, and it certainly didn't necessarily have appeal to the earlier generations of people before it. I mean, it's a unique thing from my childhood.
I suspect that the Marvel/Disney produced movies are going to continue to be good for the foreseeable future, and further. I think it's just that they're, everyone else is seeing these billion-dollar franchises, and, they're just going to start grabbing up every IP that they think might appeal to, a broad audience, and they're just going to be producing garbage. And at that point, now you have the viewer base getting turned off by it, and regardless of whether or not some of them are good and most of them are bad, are people going to want to even sift through that to find the good stuff? Hopefully, but because I enjoy the movies, but I'm definitely concerned that it's going to become oversaturated.
Let's move on. We've done a lot on Avengers, Age of Ultron, and a lot of Marvel lately. We have a big summer ahead. We have a lot of different summer movies. We have some game releases and other things going on. Real quick, though, gentlemen, let's talk about maybe one of the things you'd like to talk about on either the next week or the following week's podcast. Let's start with Guy.
Well, I just recently wrote an article for the Nerd Goblin website about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and I'm in love with that game system. I think that would be an interesting topic for us to cover at some time in the near future. For a long time, I was, put off a bit by the Dungeons & Dragons rule set and, how big and bloated and confusing it got over the years. And this new 5th edition system really brought it back home for me, and it's something I'm enjoying, and, I'd love to talk about it.
Bill, anything you're looking forward to?
There's a couple interesting topics that we can maybe cover. I've been playing a beta version of World of Warships lately, and it's not exactly a blockbuster title, but there's an interesting dynamic that's recently come up with it, where basically it is a closed beta, but they let you into the closed beta if you purchase, one of the premium items that they have for sale with the game. So, like, it does beg the question as to whether or not it's actually a closed beta or if it's some sort of premium sale access.
Yeah, I think maybe next week we'll focus on gaming a little bit more. We haven't focused on it a lot so far. I just started recently playing Dark Souls 2. I'm a late subscriber to this series, and I'm really enjoying it. And the other thing is, I recently started getting back into Marvel Heroes, which is a free-to-play game available on Steam, and I've played it off and on for its basic duration, and maybe we could talk about how to maybe get back into that game or how to start out playing that game if someone's interested. So as always, thank you for listening to the Nerd Goblin Podcast. This is episode 2. Please like us on YouTube and on iTunes. Leave us a review if you enjoyed the podcast. If you did not enjoy the podcast, just look out the window and stare at the grass for a little while instead of leaving us a review. And we'll see you next week.